If you've tried to buy wood in the past 6 months, you may have noticed something pretty crazy. The price of lumber has gone out of control. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why. Now, you're right in guessing that it has something to do with the coronavirus and the pandemic, but the answers are actually a lot more nuanced and interesting than that. So stick around and I'll explain to you what's going on. Now, this past summer, I worked on a couple of different projects that required me to go and buy some lumber. So I went out at different times throughout the summer to the hardware store to price out what lumber I needed and just see how much it was going to cost. I went first in May, and it seemed pretty reasonable at the time, but I went back a couple times after that and was just amazed at how expensive the lumber had become. And not just that, but the supply of lumber was down quite a bit. Things were hard to find, and what was left was warped and just terrible. I knew that all of this must have something to do with COVID, but the true answers were actually much more interesting than that. And in this video, I'm going to show you what I learned. In addition, be sure to stick around to the end where I'm going to give you my thoughts about where I think lumber prices are headed in the future. When I was in college, we studied economics, and one of the things that we used as a tool are called demand curves. I think everybody intuitively understands the relationship between supply and demand. But these demand curves are really helpful in kind of visualizing what's going on and helping us understand the relationship between supply and demand and the price and how all that operates and works together. So it goes something like this. When markets are operating normally and supply and demand are steady, then the price is also steady. But if something were to come along and change that, say a huge influx in supply or a huge restriction in supply, then the price and that balance can get out of whack, and the price can go way up or way down, depending upon what's going on. So in the case of lumber, there have been huge increases in demand as well as huge restrictions on supply. And both of these actions, which are being caused for a bunch of different reasons, are acting together to make the price of lumber go way up. First, let's talk about demand. Now, because of coronavirus, a lot of people are staying home. Most people, in fact, and really since March up until now. You have people that aren't going out to eat as much. You have people that are not going on vacations, have canceled all their plans. Nobody's going on any cruises, that's for sure. So the people that are sitting at home that still have jobs and they're still working and still bringing in money have nothing to do. And so a lot of people have decided that they want to beautify their home. They've either decided to do work themselves as a DIYer, or they've hired professionals to come in and build out their basements or add on a new deck, make a backyard patio or whatever. And so all that activity is really pushing up demand for lumber, especially for lumber that's been treated for use outdoors. In fact, when I went to the hardware store in June to buy some lumber for some of my outdoor projects, I found that there was almost no treated lumber even available. So it wasn't even a matter of the price, it was a matter of supply. I couldn't even get it. Another thing that is leading to an increase in demand for lumber is the housing market. Now, while we're in a tough economy right now with COVID and the effects that have taken place since then, it hasn't really affected housing. Now, there was a huge drop in housing starts in April of this year, right after a lot of those restrictions took place. But since then, housing starts have steadily increased, and we're on track right now to have one of the strongest housing markets in over a decade, really since the financial crisis of 2008. And so all that demand for housing is really using up a lot of the lumber supply that's available and driving up the price. Now, that demand that has come from the housing market, as well as the demand that has come from home improvement people, either professionals or DIYers, have really led to an increase in demand for lumber of 174% over this past year. And that is just a crazy amount of increased demand. But now let's talk about the flip side, which is also supply. So on the supply side, because of COVID, again, there have been tremendous decreases in the amount of lumber that lumber producers were able to produce. And it was different in every state. Some places, lumber mills were required to shut down for a time, which meant that they couldn't process their lumber. And that had a doubling effect for treated lumber because it not only had to be milled, but also had to be treated with chemicals. And so that restriction in supply really became a challenge as producers were trying to get the supply to the demand. Now, COVID COVID has also presented a lot of challenges for international supply chains. At my local hardware store here in Pennsylvania, I have purchased lumber that has been marked as a product of Sweden. And lumber is shipped all over the world. So it could come from Europe, it could come from Canada. And with COVID restrictions and the challenges of travel and shipping between different countries, or the delays even, that has caused some challenges in getting lumber supply to where it's needed. Even before COVID, though, there were already some challenges and restrictions on supply. In the Western US and Western Canada, there's been an infestation of pine beetles. Now, that pine beetle infestation has killed a large number of trees and reduced the stock of trees available to be cut and milled into lumber. Another huge challenge to supply has been Western wildfires. In the US this past summer, there have been extreme wildfires in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, which are all areas where a lot of lumber in the US, building lumber, is produced. The wildfires have really caused two problems. One, they're burning up the supply and destroying trees that could be used for lumber, but secondly, they're also disrupting logging operations. And so lumber mills that would normally be operating can't operate because the places where they would be operating are either covered in smoke or fire or destroyed. And so that has also caused a huge restriction in supply. Now, beyond the COVID-related challenges, beyond wildfires and insect damage and all that, there is another interesting thing that's going on with the supply of lumber, and that is one caused by the government. Now, a lot of lumber in the US actually comes from Canada, and there are currently tariffs on lumber coming in from Canada at around 20%. So what that means is that any lumber coming in from Canada is charged essentially a tax of 20%. Which then is passed on to American consumers. So when you go to buy Canadian lumber, you're paying 20% more for that lumber than you would in Canada. Now, the reason for that is somewhat complicated, but has to do with the fact that lumber producers in the US are upset with how lumber is being subsidized in Canada by the Canadian government, as most lumber operations in Canada are actually done by the various provinces in Canada. Whereas in the US, most lumber is produced by private producers. And so that benefits American lumber producers because American lumber is more attractive because it's less expensive than Canadian lumber. The challenge with that, though, is that it increases the price of lumber overall to American consumers. And so people who are going to buy that lumber now have to pay more for it. And while that benefits lumber producers in the US, it does not benefit home builders or home buyers. In fact, I even found some news articles where realtors and home builders in the US were petitioning the Trump administration to reduce those tariffs or eliminate those tariffs so that lumber would be less expensive and they would be able to purchase it. Now, most of what I've been talking about here so far really relates to softwood lumber. And this is the type of lumber that most homes in the US are built out of. It doesn't really apply to hardwood lumber. Hardwood lumber in the US is mostly used to build furniture and for wood flooring and those sorts of things. Hardwood lumber market actually hasn't been changed much by COVID or by the increase in demand. And there's a few different reasons for that as well. One thing, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, when the COVID restrictions first came about, there were only certain industries that were allowed to operate that were considered essential. Lumber mills and lumber operators were considered essential, and so a lot of those continued to produce lumber. Now, a lot of the demand that's coming from DIYers and people making home improvements didn't translate to hardwood lumber because a lot of that work was either being done on the outside of the home, and there are actually a lot of options that have become popular recently for wood flooring, like laminate and other things that don't actually take hardwood lumber. And so the demand for hardwood lumber has remained relatively steady, and so have the prices. So what does the future hold? As we get into the winter months, some of the construction, DIYing, and all that is going to slow down, and that's going to decrease demand. Also, some of the lumber producers are going to be able to beef up their supplies. So you'll see some of the supplies be replenished. The lumber mills will be able to catch up. The mills that do the processing for treated lumber will be able to catch up. And so next spring, when a lot of building starts to pick up again, I think you're going to see those prices come down. But they're not going to go back to what they were before, and there's a few different reasons for that. I think one is that consumers are getting used to paying the higher price, and it's going to be a challenge for producers to go back. There's not going to be enough competition for those producers to drive that price down. Also, the producers are going to try to restrict that supply as much as they can to get actually more money out of the lumber that they do supply. In my view, the only way that we're going to see a really huge decrease in prices is if demand completely falls off for, say, housing. So if the economy tanks, and that's a possibility because of COVID, if something terrible happens, then you're going to see that demand just plummet. And that is going to impact the supply as well as the price. The other thing that could happen is if those tariffs are eliminated. That could happen, who knows? So if those tariffs are eliminated, then that would allow for cheaper Canadian lumber to come into the US, and that would drive prices down. That would be a challenge for US lumber producers who are already being affected by all the other things that we talked about, but that could overall decrease the price and lead to more supply in the US. So what crazy lumber stories do you have? Did you have to punch out some DIYer at Home Depot in order to get the last 2x4? Did you have to resort to some craziness in order to get the lumber you needed for your projects? Let me know in the comments. Tell me your story. I'd love to hear it. So that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. If you do disagree with anything I've said, if you do have any other opinions, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And of course, if you did like this video, be sure to give me that thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to my channel for more great content like this, and we'll see you in the next one.